Steve is presently with the California Forestry Association, having begun with CFA 10 years ago. His emphasis is on increasing wood supply from California's national forests. Forest-related national statutes, regulations, and interior appropriations, as well as California diesel engine rules, carbon accounting for cap and trade, and offset programs. Those are all the things that he dabbles in with CFA. Prior to coming to CFA in 2005, he was with the United States Forest Service beginning in 1968. So thank you, Steve. And Steve will be talking about the forest products and biomass energy industries in California. Thank you, Steve.
Hey, glad to be here. I assume you can hear me okay. Let me start by trying to close out where George left off about the lumber situation. Let me just say that on our unreserved productive forest lands in California, both public and private, we have annual growth of 7.8 billion board feet a year. Billion with a B. We harvest about 1.7. We consume probably in the range of 4 to 5 billion board feet a year in California. So it's no wonder we import 70 or 80%. We don't cut enough to satisfy the consumption. And unfortunately, we're seeing the result of the overly dense, particularly public lands, of the natural disturbance agents taking over because we aren't harvesting enough. So enough on that. Let's move to hopefully something where it's almost noontime. You can kick back, relax, pull a sandwich out of your lunch bucket, and enjoy the slideshow. None of what I have to say will be anywhere as complicated as 43 years of the state of California deciding how to regulate its Forest Practices Act. So here we go. I'll start with the forest products infrastructure in California and then follow with the biomass energy industry. I think it's worthwhile to look a little bit at the history, and actually I'll go back even to 1980 up to the present, and then talk about the current situation and some about the opportunities for expansion, and then follow with the biomass power plant industry. So here's a typical large sawmill cogeneration biomass power plant infrastructure. This happens to be Sierra Pacific Industries in Quincy. So I think it's important right off the bat here. A reason I want to talk a little about the history is I think it's always useful to anybody that wants to talk about the forest sector in California to understand a little bit about the last 35 years or so, because we are simply a remnant of what we were in the 1980s. There's been a dramatic reduction in infrastructure since the early 1980s, and you can see particularly about 1989 to about 1995, which is, not, I'm sure it's not a surprise to most of the people that are looking in here today. I mean, that's the northern spotted owl in spades, followed by the California spotted owl, followed by the goshawk, followed by the Pacific fisher, followed by now the Humboldt martin, and on and on and on. In 1988, there was 4.7 billion board feet of saw timber harvested in California, a little over about 60% of annual growth. By oops, sorry, I didn't turn my phone off. Sorry about that. So in 1996, the harvest level had dropped to 2.3 billion board feet, a 50% decline in 8 years. And as a result, as you would expect, we had a 40% decline in infrastructure that occurred during that time period. So what's left today? We have 24-dimension lumber mills varying from 35 million board feet to 175 million board feet. We have two very productive and efficient veneer mills, one in Wairika and one at Weed. both of which only produce green veneer. It's then shipped to Oregon to actually be processed into plywood. And we have one remaining particle board plant, and it's in Martell near Jackson. I don't track the small mills, but Larry Swan does at the Forest Service in Vallejo, so that information is available should anybody be interested. And I think it's also noteworthy on the infrastructure to know that there are only 3 remaining small businesses left in the infrastructure arena for California Forest Products. They're Trinity River at Weaverville, Shasta Green at Bernie, and Sierra Forest Products in Terabella, just south of Porterville. And again, here's why the infrastructure has dramatically decreased. Again, you can see in the late 80s, it was at one of its peaks at just over 4.5 billion board feet of total harvest, and then it declined rapidly. And with the Northwest Forest Plan going into effect right in here, and you can see it's a steep decline on the Forest Service from about 1990 to 94, and it's been a slow but steady decline until very recently on the private lands. And the infrastructure just responds to wood supply. It's that simple. And how that wood supply comes in terms of annual flow. These mills that remain are because they're owned by entrepreneurs who are just aggressive and try to figure out a niche to be able to compete in a global marketplace. And they are the what's left. And to operate in California is probably the most expensive place on the planet to try to operate and stay in business. So that's where we are, where we've been. Let's move to perhaps a more positive note, where there might be some potential opportunities. We're very fortunate that the National Forest Foundation recently had a grant that they're able to give to the Beck Group, who did an assessment of wood business in California and where opportunities might exist to expand the marketplace in terms of infrastructure. And I'll mention 3 things actually that they came up with. Actually, no, let me say 4. I'll mention 4. The best and brightest opportunity appears to be cross-laminated timber. I'm sure most of you have heard about that. It's simply you put down a row of 2x6s, and then you put a row of 2x6s in the other direction, and then a row of 2x6s again in this direction. You keep doing that back and forth perpendicular until you have a panel that's thick enough to provide the strength you need for the structural integrity of the building. And you glue these together. Now the beauty of cross-laminated timber for the California Forest Products infrastructure is that this is a 2x6 wood hog. I mean, you make this thing out of 2x6s. And it just so happens that the Dimension sawmill lumber business in California, the what's remaining 2x6s, is a mainstay. So this has tremendous opportunity. There is one plant currently being constructed in Oregon. There are design guides that are starting to become available to architects, and the architects are starting to call out for cross-laminated timber, and buildings are starting to go up. Well, that's all good news, I think. Cross-laminated timber is going to become bigger and bigger and bigger in the marketplace. Oregon State University is on point where they have a lab now that is exclusively working on cross-laminated timber. Now, let me move to small-scale biomass. Now, the Beck Group specifically addressed small-scale biomass because of SB 1122 in California, which calls for 50 megawatts of power being generated by power plants of 3 megawatts or less. And this is typically what that would look like. There's one in Merced. There's one, I believe, in Oakdale. The Beck Group reviewed this in great detail since it has the statutory underpinning. And what they found was, if you want to build, own, and operate and maintain this kind of a facility, less than 3 megawatts, it's going to take an 18 to 22 cent per kilowatt hour power purchase agreement if you want to stay in business. The PUC took a couple of years to develop regulations for SB 1122, and it's got complications to it. Basically, it provides at least an opportunity for a 12.77 cent price floor. The outcome of what the Beck Group found was, if you're going to pay for the construction and you're going to operate and maintain a facility like this, 12.77 cents isn't even close. Let's move to oriented strand board. Obviously, oriented strand board is a huge piece of residential construction and strip malls and so on and so forth. So it is an integral part. It's directly tied to housing starts, and is a big deal, in part because the Beck Group found there is not a single oriented strand board plant in the West. And so there's probably a significant transportation advantage to the demand for oriented strand board in this part of the country if somebody would build an OSB plant. Now, anybody that decides to do that, it's highly unlikely they're going to build in California that has the most aggressive, arduous set of regulations in the country. But, you know, Reno, maybe eastern Utah, maybe Boise, Idaho, who knows. But anyway, there is a hole there for oriented strand board manufacture. And then last I'll mention the Beck Group looked some at dimension lumber and veneer and whether or not there is any room for expansion. And they concluded, hey, well, it looks like there might be room for expansion on the North Coast. And I think in part the reason is we've just had in the last 4 or 5 years closure of a flakeboard plant at Crescent City, closure of a flakeboard plant at Arcata, closure at Corbell, closure at on and on and on. So there's a reason why those pieces of infrastructure went out of business. And so now for somebody to come right in and build a new facility would raise a lot of people's eyebrows. Is that a wise investment or not? So that is, I think, the sum and total of the opportunities for expansion. Let me just say on sawmills, as I said here a few minutes ago, the milling industry goes as the wood supply goes. When the Forest Service does what the regional forester wants to do, which is triple or quadruple their annual pace of thinnings on the national forest, that would mean they go from about 250 million board feet a year of saw timber sold to 1 billion board feet. You will see the milling infrastructure respond. Now, if that 1 billion board feet or even 500 million board feet was on a sustainable basis and the industry and the entrepreneurs could see that, hey, there's a new source of supply, the industry will respond and infrastructure will get built. But not until that supply picture improves. Okay, let's move to the biomass power plant industry. So there's two kinds of biomass power plants, at least in our jargon here in California. And by the way, the biomass power plant industry in California is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/3 of the entire biomass power plant industry in the United States. So here's a typical, what we call a standalone biomass power plant. This happens to be Bernie Forest Power at Bernie, 30 megawatt plant, consumes 240,000 bone dry tons of wood waste annually. A bone dry ton is about half of a green ton. Green ton generally is 40 to 50% moisture. So that's all that a bone dry ton means. What's more important is that it takes 8,000 bone dry tons of wood waste to get 1 megawatt. So that's a universal truth that you can stash away to memory if you didn't know that already. So this is a typical standalone power plant. It has to buy feedstock to run that power plant. It does not have a free source of energy like wind or solar or geothermal, or what we call our cogeneration power plants, which is a biomass power plant like this, only it sits in a mill yard and was constructed and sized based on the amount of mill residuals that the sawmill would produce. And then you'd use those mill residues to power the power plant, provide power to the entire facility, the sawmill and everything else you need electricity for to run that site. And then you'd sell the excess of electricity that you made, if there was any, into the grid to one of the large utilities, or in some cases even a municipal utility. So that's the way cogens work. They're generally sized to match up with the residuals that a sawmill is producing. So the feedstock to run that power plant is essentially free to the power plant. So that's the big difference between a standalone like Bernie Forest Power and a cogeneration plant like you have at Sierra Pacific Industries at Anderson, at Sonora, at Quincy, and so forth. Okay. So I'm going to talk a second about the history of the biomass power plant industry in California, in case you're not aware. Back in 1978, there's a federal statute passed called PURPA, which brought to life the potential for biomass power. Then, right about late 70s or around 1980, there was somebody then in California by the name of Jerry Brown, who happened to be governor at that point in time, who recognized the value of biomass power, of being able to utilize wood waste, and that's urban, ag, and forest wood waste, and burning it in a controlled combustion environment in a boiler to create steam to spin a turbine, which turns an electric generator to make electricity. And then if it's a cogen plant tied to a sawmill, after that steam has turned the turbine, then you run the steam through some tubing over to your dry kilns and run your dry kilns before you come back to the condenser and recondense it and use that water again. Jerry Brown understood in 1979 that UC Riverside had done research on the pollutants that come from burning wood in a biomass boiler versus open field pile burning it. And what that research showed was a 98% reduction in particulate matter and methane and other criteria pollutants if you burn the wood waste in a boiler compared to open field pile burning. So state government at that time set essentially a 12-cent price floor in order to create the biomass power plant industry, essentially telling investors, you come in with a proposal to build a biomass power plant. This is oversimplifying, but bear with me. If you'll come in and say you're going to build a biomass power plant, we will give you at least a 12-cent power purchase agreement. The result of that was, in the 1980s, there were 66 power plants built in California, generating almost 1,000 megawatts. And that was up until about 1990. And that's the green line here, was the power payments that were being made. And then you can see just after 95, that dropped precipitously. And that's because the initial power purchase agreements were up for renewal. And the 12-cent price floor no longer applied on renewal. And natural gas prices back then were around 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And so the utilities offered renewals to biomass power plants at a much lower price than what had transpired in the 80s. And so the average price dropped like a rock until, as you can see, up until about 2005, it leveled out some and then dropped again because the price of natural gas dropped. But as you would expect, just like with the sawmilling industry, when you take away the value, in this case, the power purchase agreement price for the biomass power plant, the number of power plants that were still operating reduced significantly. So we tracked that with this complicated map. And let me catch up to my notes here. What has essentially happened is, as you can see, most of the power plants were built on the valley floor, right in the middle of the agricultural fields, which made a lot of sense, obviously, because all the crop agriculture had to get rid of their waste at the end of each harvest season. And so you plop a power plant right in the middle of the ag fields. So your transportation cost is very, very low to bring the woody waste from the crops to the power plant. That was a good deal. And that's what created all these plants. In the foothills and in Northern California, there were also a significant number of plants built. But if you look at those, generally, not all, but generally, those plants were built below snow line, obviously, for good reason, because you can't get feedstock to them if they're buried in snow. And that also creates a dilemma for plants that are looking to forest biomass to be part of or most of their feedstock, because they can't move it during the winter, so they have to have bigger fuel yards and stockpiles, so to speak. Well, the situation is, for the biomass power plant industry, I'll just say it, some won't agree with me, but I'll say what I think. It takes 6 or 7 cents per kilowatt hour to own, operate, and maintain a power plant, period. If it costs you money to go get feedstock, it's on top of 6 or 7 cents. If you're down here in the ag fields, it may only be 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour to cut, load, and haul the crop agriculture feedstock to your power plant. But up in the forests, you have to cut, skid, pile, chip, load, and haul the forest biomass. And that can easily be 3 to 5 cents. Well, for those that need 5 cents and it takes 7 to run your plant, voila, the 12-cent number comes up again. The 12-cent number back in '80 was for a reason, because that's what it takes if you want to have a robust industry. And most of these plants, the days of 12 cents have long gone by. And so the industry has shrunk dramatically such that today, well, let me back up. In 2009, we had 36 of the 66 that we had in around 1990. By 2009, we were down to 36 operating plants. Today, we only have 22. And we have, I'll show here, I think. Yeah, we have, you see this column here. These are the power plants that have a expiration date approaching. There's 3, 6, 8, 9. 9 power plants have expiration dates in the next 1 to 7 months. That's a very bad deal, because if things stay the way they are, with state government not incentivizing biomass through the PUC to the utilities will continue to offer prices at or below what it takes to just run the plant, let alone get feedstock to the plant. And so by October of this year, unless something dramatically changes, these plants are going to go away. That's 184 megawatts. At a time with the mortality that we have that's expanding northward, I mean, the timing couldn't be any worse. We desperately need these plants. Then since about 2009, here's the 8 plants that have gone idle because of the expiring, because their energy price contract expired as early as just last month, in the case of DG Fairhaven and Delano. To those, some expired as far back as 2011. But it's not a pretty picture of all these plants sitting idle. And then these are the ones that are still operating. There's 13 who have some breathing room on their energy price contracts. They aren't going to expire anytime real soon. Now, so why am I harping on this? It's because of this. Remember I talked about the difference in the pollutants associated with burning wood waste in a biomass boiler versus open pile burning. Well, we've known now for 17 years what the environmental benefit is of consuming wood in a boiler versus pile burning. Dr. Greg Morris of Green Power Institute did this calculation in a publication in 1999. You can Google it, The Value of Biomass Power by Greg Morris, 1999. And then Placer County, who has been trying for years to get a renewable energy protocol through the Air Resources Board for carbon credits for renewable energy with no success, did 2 studies to look at this same question again. They did one in 2011 and one in 2015. Placer County, Bruce Springsteen, you can Google those. What they did was verify the 1979 study that was done by UC Riverside of the 98% reduction in pollutants. So the point is, there's an 11.4 cent per kilowatt hour environmental benefit of burning wood waste in a biomass boiler instead of piling it and burning it in an ag field or in the forest. We aren't charging the ratepayers a penny of that environmental benefit. If the state doesn't create policy around this and start charging some of this to the ratepayer, or use cap and trade net revenues, or whatever, to add to the 7 cents it costs to run a power plant to get the feedstock to the power plant, The power plant industry is going to continue to die in California. There's just no other way around it. Now, it isn't just the biomass power plant industry is dying. We're now at the point where there are at least 3 sawmills still in operation who just rely on having the ability to haul their mill residuals to a biomass power plant, where they don't have a cogen power plant on site at their sawmill. There's at least 3. And there's at least one of those 3 that the biomass power plant they haul to, if it goes down by next October, that sawmill is probably also going to close. Profit margins of all these facilities, including the sawmills, are just razor thin. And one sawmill owner, I think he was joking, said, well, the way things are going, we're going to have to apply for an air permit to go back to teepee burners that we had in the 1970s. That seems to be the, and what he was doing, of course, was showing his disappointment that the state of California will not step in and incentivize biomass power again. So a summary here. The forest products infrastructure. As I pointed out, sawmills and veneer mills, I don't think there's going to be any change unless a power plant goes down and that sawmill is relying on that plant to take their mill residues to. But essentially no change unless there is a supply change, and particularly the national forests. There's plenty of growth out there. I mean, even if we were only taking a third of the growth off of the national forest, that would be a harvest level of at least 1 billion board feet, where today it's about 250 million board feet of sawlog material. The cross-laminated timber to substitute for steel and concrete in building construction, as I pointed out, I think that has enormous potential. Whether or not a cross-laminated timber manufacturing facility would get built in California or not, I'm not certain. It may actually be cheaper to build it somewhere else, haul our 2x6s to that plant to manufacture the panels, simply because of the arduous nature of our regulatory environment in California. Maybe the plant will get built in Reno, for instance. In the biomass power plant, well, and then let me say, I've never had much faith in, and the Beck Group just substantiated my thoughts about biomass power plants of less than 3 megawatts in size. Nobody's going to pay 18 to 22 cents to run a plant of that size. The unfortunate part about 3 megawatt and smaller power plants is the labor cost. There is a price break at about a 10 megawatt power plant, and it's mostly around labor. 10 megawatts and up is very similar in terms of labor cost to 3 megawatts and smaller. You got to have somebody to run the plant. Even if you can do the engineering and monitor the plant from afar, something can go wrong with electronics, so you have to have an engineer on site. In addition to that, you have to have a guard on site 24/7, because if you don't, somebody will come in, and this has happened, somebody will come in and actually cut the copper out of the plant while the plant is running. It's just unbelievable, but has happened. So you have a labor cost that's fixed with the 3 megawatt and smaller. The bigger issue with the biomass power plant industry is these expiring energy price contracts and the likely loss of 8 more power plants, leaving only 14 in October. Now the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, currently has a draft resolution out right now for an auction for biomass power And that auction would occur, I'm guessing, no later than May 1st, that these plants can bid into. But right now, the draft that PUC has put out for comment, and comments are due today, only requires the large utilities cumulatively to buy 30 megawatts. 12 for PG&E, 12 for Southern California Edison, and 6 for San Diego. 30 megawatts is one power plant. In the case of Delano is a 50 megawatt plant. And so, frankly, it's not of any help. And it certainly isn't much help for the mortality issue we have. Just in the Southern Sierras, the estimate by the Forest Service from Lake Isabella to Sonora is about 20 million bone dry tons of dead trees. And that's I think that's about 2,500 megawatts of power if you removed it all. And you probably remove it over a 3-year period. So that's 800 megawatts per year of feedstock that you have available if you removed it all. That's all of the existing industry plus the 235 megawatts of plants that have gone idle the last 4 or 5 years. So you could fully run that entire industry, including restarting all those idle plants, 100% on dead trees for 3 years. And the beetle epidemic is expanding northward. It hasn't stopped. It started in the pine type on the Sierra and Sequoia National Forests and in the oak woodland down there. As of last October, 60% of the pine vegetative type was dead. They're going to take more plots here this spring, but they're guessing that it's now at least 80% dead. It has proceeded up through the mixed conifer and into the red fir and is proceeding north. There's 5 billion board feet of dead, I believe, just on the Sierra National Forest. That's about 30% of the standing inventory. Or no, it's more than that. It's more like 40% of the standing inventory on the Sierra is dead. So that's not going to go away. And so I think I'll stop there, and I'm sure there are questions.